Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast for the Eastbourne Literary Festival, the festival whose mission is to convince you that you are a writer. I'm Russ Miles, a local writer, listener and festival instigator, and in this podcast I'll be chatting to many diverse and interesting writers about how they write to inspire you to pick up the pen, keyboard or even phone and start writing. For this episode, we are joined by a writer who has been a supporter and fan of our festival since our very early days. Louise Morrish is a historical fiction author and librarian from Hampshire. She writes stories inspired by the lives of women in the past who achieved extraordinary things, but whom history has forgotten. Louise always knew she wanted to write books, but it wasn't until her late 30s that she finally had the chance to take her hobby seriously. In 2012, she completed the Faber online Write Your Novel course, and then, armed with her manuscript, she began the submission process. Her debut novel was Operation Moonlight, and it won the Penguin Random House First Novel Competition. Just recently, Louise has released her new novel, Women of War. Lou, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Russ. It's lovely to be on your podcast.
It's so great to have you here. And it seems almost an entire lifetime since I first spoke to you about the Eastbourne Literary Festival, and you were so kind and so generous with your advice and time to help me wrestle with the details of everything we have going on. So just wanted to get that off the bat as a big thank you to you for that time and that generosity.
That's no worries at all. Absolute pleasure.
Wonderful. Okay, so the new book has just come out, Women of War.
Yes.
Can you give a no-spoiler synopsis of your latest book? It's always difficult to ask an author to do the no-spoiler version.
Yes, well, I'll do my best. So Women of War is inspired by the extraordinary adventures of the Women's Hospital Corps in World War One. And actually, Penguin New Zealand created a really good hook, which I'm just going to basically repeat here because I think it just sums it up really well. They said, in 1914, a surgeon and a soldier go to war, one boldly, one clandestinely. Both are women and both will change history. And that basically sums up the book. We follow two women. One of them is a soldier, one of them is a surgeon, and their paths cross during the First World War in an extraordinary way, and it's based on true events and true women. And it was a real joy to write, actually. So I hope that explains it a little bit.
I think it does a perfect job. So when it comes to the two characters that are the sort of leads of the book, how did you find those characters? How did you discover these true, as you say, true stories out there? How did you bump into them?
It's a long story, and it starts way back in 2012 when I accidentally came across the forgotten memoir of a woman called Dorothy Lawrence in the library stacks of a public library that I was working in. And she was an extraordinary young woman. At the age of 19, she was desperate to become a journalist, but because of her upbringing, she was illegitimate, she was very poor, she was not very well educated at all. She couldn't pursue that dream in the usual way. And so when the First World War broke out, she decided to try an extraordinary stunt. She thought she would disguise herself as a soldier and somehow get to the battlefields and report on the truth of the war as the first female British war correspondent. So her memoir is quite a strange little book, I have to say, but it just absolutely intrigued me that a woman could do that kind of thing back then in 1914, and she was only young, and it just intrigued me. And I wrote a novel based on her, but reimagining what happened to her, because her actual real life was very tragic, and so I wanted to change her ending. So I wrote this book. But back in 2012, when I had that first idea and then I wrote the book, no publisher was interested in it at all. They absolutely not interested. But since then, obviously I've now got it published, and the things have changed. I think publishers particularly are very much more interested in forgotten stories and untold stories. particularly female angles that have, up to this point, perhaps not been given the airtime that they should have been given. There's so many things that women have done in the past that we just simply don't know about. And my obsession is digging those events out and those extraordinary lives out and then reimagining them in my fiction. So Dorothy Lawrence was a perfect example of that. But in fact, this book, Women of War, which is, of course, inspired by Dorothy Lawrence, is also inspired by a real doctor called Dr. Louise Garrett Anderson, whose mother, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, was the first British woman to qualify as a doctor. And Louisa became a surgeon as well. She followed in her mother's footsteps and became a surgeon at a time when hardly any women at all were doctors. It was a really difficult thing to be a doctor as a woman then. And when the First World War broke out, Louisa Garrett Anderson and her colleague Flora Murray offered their services to the War Office to help in military surgery, help save the lives of soldiers. And they were told by the War Office that women were completely unsuited to military surgery and they should go home and stay safe. And Louisa wasn't having any of it. And she was accepted by the French Red Cross to go over to France and set up an all-female run military hospital in France, the first of its kind. And when I discovered her story, quite by accident, I was able to put the two stories together. Even though in real life Dorothy Lawrence and Louisa Garrett Anderson never met, they weren't operating at the same time quite over in France. I changed things slightly. I changed timelines and I changed the path of their meeting and had them meet. And that is what ignited the story, and Penguin bought the story on that basis. I hope that explains. I'm sorry, I've waffled a little bit there.
No waffling at all. I think if anything, it's a great teaser to these sort of this backdrop to the fiction that you've written. And is that fair to say that's your style, that's your method, that you look for these real stories out there, look for these really quite incredible, admirable people? I mean, you could argue you may find as much inspiration from not so admirable people sometimes, but you've found these incredibly admirable people and you've turned them into the inspiration for a novel where you can entwine their lives. And is that your way? Is that what you look for when you're trying to create your fiction? Is that your path to the story?
Yeah, it is. When you write a novel, you have to put your entire heart into it. And so you have to be writing something that really fires you up, that keeps you writing, that, it's a very long, very arduous, quite sometimes lonely process. And you have to be just totally obsessed almost with what you're writing. And I have found that I am particularly obsessed by the stories of forgotten women in the past. They have to really grab me, obviously. It really has to be something that I'm desperate to find out more about, because you have to do lots and lots of research as a historical novelist, of course. And I can go down lots of rabbit holes with research, but, it's part of the joy of it. So, yeah, I think I'm getting a bit of a reputation as someone whose kind of method is to find those forgotten women and then reimagine them on the page, trying to keep as much to the truth as possible. When I read historical fiction myself, I want to learn. I want to learn stuff. I don't want to be told or taught the wrong things or misled in any way. And so equally, I don't want to mislead anybody else. If I've had to deviate from something at a particular time or a particular detail, I'll always put that in the author notes so that the reader is aware that this was all based on truth, this bit wasn't, so that they're not confused. But for the most part, everything in my books is based in some way on something that actually happened and real women that actually did these things.
And when you're building those characters who are not quite the people that really had these lives that inspired you in the first place, do they take on a new life that is obviously in your world, your imagination? And how do you sort of work with that, with the truth of the facts, and it's almost like you had a relationship with the historical figure, the real person out there in the world, perhaps many, many years ago. And now you've developed this relationship with the fictional character. I'm interested in how, if that's difficult as a set of boards to tread, or whether it's a very natural thing to work with, that there is a departure in your head from the original instigation of the idea from the person you've read about into this character that, as you said, you pour your heart into a novel when you're writing it. You pour your heart and your emotion into these characters. Is there a moment where you breathe life into them and they go their own path and they have their own interesting ways through your story? And how does that feel when that happens?
That's a brilliant question, Russ. That's a brilliant, brilliant question, because it really does get to the heart of it. So first off, I always change the name of the character. So although the main character in Women of War is Edie Lawrence, I've kept Lawrence as the surname, just as a homage to Dorothy Lawrence, but I changed her first name to Edie. And Louisa Garrett Anderson is Lucinda Garland in the book. So by changing the name of the character, first of all, you've taken a step away from that real person. You can never know wholly what somebody was like in the past. You know, you've only got perhaps their diary or their memoir to go on, or sometimes letters, sometimes books written on them. But for the most part, the women that I'm working with had very, very little written about them or for them. And so I haven't got a great deal to go on. I can surmise quite a lot from how they must have been to survive in the world they were in. So an example of that would be Louisa Garrett Anderson was a very driven woman. She was very professional, and she had to be, to exist and survive in the patriarchal world of medicine. And she didn't suffer fools gladly. And sometimes in one or two of the books that I read about her, people would say that she, perhaps was slightly prickly sometimes, or you didn't want to cross her. And when I wrote the first draft of Women of War, I brought a lot of that to the page, and I made my character, Lucinda Garland, very similar to that, very driven, professional, almost curt, really. And my editor actually said, I think you need to make her more sympathetic so that the reader empathises with her more and doesn't get turned off by some of the things that you've got her saying. Some of the encounters that she has with her colleagues and with certain gentlemen that she has to deal with. I had to change quite a lot of that because it wasn't as sympathetic as it could have been, I think. I don't know if that's answered your question or not. I have to tread a difficult line of trying to stay close enough that you could recognise the person, and I've stayed, what's the word I'm looking for? True to them, if you like. But that I've also brought them to a modern audience who wants to really like that character. And so you can't really put too many things in the way of that. You have to try and bring the reader along with you and show their vulnerable side, show the character's vulnerable side, show their human side, show their flaws, but in a way that creates sympathy and not dislike. Does that make sense? And Dorothy Lawrence was an interesting one because her actual life ended very tragically, and so I knew from the word go that I would not be recreating what happened to her in the end. I would be changing her ending completely. And when I realised that, I thought to myself, well, I can make my character Edie be her own woman and not worry too much about trying to stick to what I think Dorothy was like. Dorothy ended her life in a mental hospital, unfortunately. And so I decided that wouldn't be the case for Edie. And so I was much freer to do whatever I wanted with her. So I hope that's answered the question, Russ.
I think it has. And I think it also speaks to that point I was talking about, the relationship that you develop with the characters. And I think there's a kindness that you can bring to those characters stroke people, because in some respects you could give the inspiration for Edie a like you say, a different life, the life that she maybe deserved and didn't get. So there's almost a beautiful gift that can be left out there in your pages that says this is a different direction. It's not to undermine the lived experience of that person, but I think Holly in a previous episode talks about the wonderful question that is, what if? What if this happens instead? And you're asking that about a real person and going, what if the path was different? What if these two people met? What could happen next? What could that story look like? And so that's got to be the license, surely, of good fiction, to be able to go what if and go in new directions, especially when you're giving such a kind gift to this person and the life that they had.
Yeah, bringing their memory back into the light, bringing their life back into the light. So people would, 99% of people that I ask, have you ever heard of Dorothy Lawrence? Nope, they've never heard of her. And even Louisa Garrett Anderson, who was a pioneering medical woman, whose mother was the first qualified doctor in Britain, never heard of her. When she set up her Women's Hospital Corps, and they eventually ended up creating another all-female hospital in London, they saved the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers in the First World War. And yet we never hear about this. I'd never heard about them. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement for women in the 1910s, in Edwardian England, for women to be saving tens of thousands of soldiers' lives. I think that deserves to be remembered.
Oh, 100%.
So even if I'm reimagining some of it, at least having read my novel, you will now know that these women did these things. And that to me is, and then I can go out and I can talk about my books really confidently because I'm so keen to spread the message of these women. So it just gives me a fire in my belly for it in a way that just banging on about myself would not work. Talking about other women that have done really brave things, it is just brilliant. I love it.
Now, come on, you're a librarian. There isn't much of a more respected job in my book than that. And also, frankly, a great deal of envy that comes with that job as far as I'm concerned. But I thought I'd ask you a bit about the lives you've encountered that you haven't featured yet in your fiction as well. Because in your research, as you say, there are so many potential stories out there of particularly women that have not been put into or given the limelight, should we say, not been put into the press, not been heralded or even celebrated. And how do you go about selecting the ones that speak to you and that go, okay, there's something more in this? I can imagine it being quite a challenge.
Yeah, sometimes it's tricky to know which to concentrate on next. So I'm currently working on book 4, and my editor doesn't know anything about book 4 at the moment, and she may not want book 4, but I am very, very excited about it. And it's about the precursor to the female athletics movement. It's about women in Victorian times who were our very first female endurance athletes. And again, nobody's heard of them. Nobody has heard of them. And I'm very, very keen to write this. But also I've got another idea, which is clamouring to be told. But I'm leaving that slightly on the back burner because the research involved is quite daunting. So at the moment, I know that I can do the one about the female athletes. I can do that without needing to do too much research. And then once that one's done, then I might be in a better place to look at the one that will involve quite a lot of physical research. I choose things on that basis, I suppose. And I know that I've got a good idea when I cannot stop thinking about it. So all the time that I'm talking about Operation Moonlight, my first book, that's what I mostly talk about to groups. All the time I'm talking about Operation Moonlight. All the time I'm promoting Women of War. All the time I'm editing the sequel to Women of War, which is coming out next year. I'm thinking about book 4. I can't get it out of my head. I just want to write book 4. So I know that I've got, in my opinion, I've got a really good idea because it won't leave my head. If I didn't think about it, if it left my head for weeks at a time and I'd have to force myself to sit down and research it or do some writing on it, I know it wouldn't be the one for me because, books can take a year, 2 years, 3 years to be published. You have to really want to write that book, really be passionate about it. That's the word, passionate.
We actually have interviewed an author for the podcast, but I don't think the episode's quite gone out yet. And I think the longest we've heard is 20 years of a
Really?
book being written and being edited and changed. And so, yes, I couldn't chime more with me. That feeling of I can't leave the book alone. I cannot stop pursuing this. He certainly had that, as well as that feeling you've got. And I was going to actually sort of focus in quickly on the research element of the books that you're working through, because you mentioned you're holding back from the research and diving into what would be book 5, I think, because book 4 is not written yet, and you've got to keep perhaps a piece of your mind very focused on that writing. When you're doing the research, do you have any particular references you go to that are great mines of information and anecdotes and maybe lived experience from these periods that we've never lived in? I don't know about you. I look like I could be old enough to live in some of these, but you certainly do not. So you've got to go into not just a person's lived experience, but you've got to go and be authentic to a time period where there's an enormous amount of worldly context going on. And so do you have locations and places that you read about and go, well, I get my best stuff from there to help me understand this time period? And also, I've got another question on that, if I may. I don't like to throw too many questions at once, but so you've got the research, and do you have your mines of value that you can go to? And also, have you ever been really surprised by a fact that you've discovered from a particular time that you've been exploring?
Oh, okay. Well, being a librarian means that I am able to access quite a lot of online archives and research portals, if you like, that perhaps other people aren't aware of. So I do use a lot of archival material that I'm able to access online, especially newspapers. I find that reading newspapers from the time is hugely, hugely helpful. It gives a real flavour of what people were obsessed with at that time, interested in, worried about, what fashion was like, what they were eating, what they were doing in their spare time, what crimes were being committed. Newspapers are brilliant, brilliant ways of feeling like you're reading the actual news of the time. So you can read many, many history books, and some of them are brilliant, but they're written by people now about the past through a certain viewpoint, whereas newspapers are just, that's it, life on the page as it was then. So I would say that I mostly look at archival and newspaper stuff. Books, library books, I get so many reservations. It's quite an expensive thing to have to keep getting reservations, but the library service is just invaluable to me. I just couldn't write my books without them. I couldn't afford to buy all the books that I need. So the library service is just unbelievably important and helpful. So I think that answers your first question. And then you asked about whether I was surprised by an element of the research.
Yeah, it was. Did you find throughout all of this research you've had to do for your books and going back into those moments, those times, was there anything that leapt out and you're like, goodness, I didn't realize it felt like that then? Or I didn't realize that was what it was like at that point in time, a contextual maybe piece of information that made you go, oh, wow, well, that feels different. That's a slightly surprising thing to discover.
Well, that's a brilliant, brilliant question, Ross. It's put me slightly on the spot, though. I'll have to answer it slightly differently in that I can't think off the top of my head of anything that made me rethink how things might have been in the past. I'm sure there must be lots of examples of it, but I can't think off the top of my head. But I will say that I am constantly surprised by the things that I accidentally stumble across. So, I mean, just as an example with book 4, I accidentally stumbled over these women who did endurance races, foot races, things like 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours for wages. I'm not joking. Yeah, incredible feats of endurance, and they were very famous in their day. And so I constantly am surprised by things that happened a long time ago that you don't think could have happened. Okay, nowadays you can have endurance races where people do astonishingly long trail runs and things like that. But you wouldn't have thought they did it in the past because they wouldn't have had the time and they would have been busy just trying to live and exist. And who would have had the time to have just walked and walked and walked? Some women did and got very famous and in very few cases, but some got quite wealthy and famous through it. So and they were the precursors to these female athletes. So, yeah, at a time when women weren't supposed to be walking anywhere, certainly not unchaperoned.
It's amazing, isn't it, as well? I mean, I've had a similar experience, and I've seen it in a couple of some of my favourite novels, actually. So the Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris, I think, does this really well. It feels so contemporary. You sit there going, really? They went to a law court and then they had these sorts of conversations. And you're like, hang on, right now, that at that point in time, there was no dentistry. Life was short and brutish. And yet it sounds so civilized. And it shocked me quite deeply because you tend to think, particularly that far back in time, you think of it as barely survivable. And yet people were almost as obsessed with the minutiae of the day and their legal wranglings in those cases. It's very surprising to find, perhaps you found this too, that the past is very normal in some respects and very relatable in many, many respects. It's perhaps a little smaller jump back in time for yourself, but still a little bit surprising to find it's so contemporary. But I have to admit, I'm shocked to hear that there's such a thing as 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours. I'm putting a call out to all those ultra runners out there and saying, where is this event gone? And that sounds incredible.
A wonderful adage to that is that when the women were doing these long distance walks, towards the end of their challenge, if they looked like they were going to be successful, they'd have to have a man walking in front of them with a pistol to stop anybody trying to sabotage them by throwing sticks at their feet or knocking them over or shooting them to stop them because they bet against them. And when the women looked likely to actually, do it, yeah, they had to have protection. That was a surprising thing.
I'm trying to imagine that these days. I'm trying to imagine someone doing a marathon and then going, look, they're going to break some records, so we better get some protection.
God, we're going to lose our wager here because we've bet against her.
I like the unruly side of it. I like the rebel side of it. It's like it could go very wrong. People might actually sabotage this. I'd like to go, if you don't mind, back in your writing journey a little bit now and talk about where it started. Because as I mentioned in the introduction, your journey began, or at least perhaps the journey was properly begun with a course, with the Faber Write Your Novel online course. How did that come about? Well, I guess the question there is for you, how did you approach that course? And then what did it mean to you? What did it give you that spurred you on to go, right, now I'm going for the next step, which, as we all know, there's drafting and then there's publication, and they're very different processes and require very different reserves of emotional gumption and everything else that goes with it. Can you explain what that journey was like for you and what it was like to do that course and maybe what sort of debt you may have to it, if that makes sense?
I owe an enormous debt really to Faber. I really do. They're not the only kids on the block. There are other courses out there just as good, I think. But I chose Faber because I'd heard of them. I'd heard the name. So my children were all young at the time. It was back in 2012. And I had been writing for several years, but completely in secret. I hadn't shown anybody anything. But my husband knew that I was writing a lot and that my ultimate dream was to one day be published. But it seemed to me a completely unattainable dream. I knew nobody in publishing at all. I come from a completely unpublishing family. There was nobody that I could turn to or aspire to be or anything like that. And it seemed to me that all the authors that I read and admired had somehow had paths to their publication that were closed to me. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't rich. I wasn't married to somebody in the publishing industry. It just, how would I do it? I don't know. So I think my husband got a bit fed up with me mithering on about that. And in 2012, he said to me, look, I just think you should do a course, because that might it might get it out of your system. You could meet people that are also writing, and it might just make you a bit of a happier person. So he agreed that I could do this Faber course. Now, it was expensive. Back then it was expensive. It was the cost of a foreign family holiday at the time. And we didn't have that sort of money. We had 3, young children, and we couldn't really afford to do it. But bless him, we scraped the money together and I did it. And it really did change everything, but not immediately. It's something that you look back on and realise, yes, that was a turning point. That was me committing to this in a way that I hadn't up to that point. And the main thing was that I had to share my work with strangers. And up to that point, I had not had the guts to do that. So to actually share your work in progress with people you hadn't met and were ready and willing to give you constructive feedback was utterly terrifying. It's really vulnerable, especially when you're writing something you're close to your heart and you're so new to it that anything anyone says that's slightly negative, you can't get it out of your head. Whereas now, of course, I deal with that all the time and it's fine. You know what to pay attention to and you know what to let flow, and it's totally different now. But back then, it was a huge, huge step to take, and Faber gave me that opportunity in a safe environment with really good tutors and a cohort of writers at the same stage as me, one of whom, Julie Marr, is now a published author as well, and she's remained my friend since then, and we're email buddies since then, and we are huge support to each other. So it gave me a friend. And also it gave me that confidence to show my work to strangers, which you have to do if you want to be published in any form. If you want to be traditionally published or self-published or hybrid published, you're going to have to let that work be seen by other eyes. There's no point keeping it to yourself and worrying about people's reactions or people's responses or people's criticisms of it. You have to let it go.
I picked up on there the support group angle of things. That's been a bit of a theme, is that most authors have got select few, as almost a number of circles around them of people that are entrusted with different aspects of what they're working through. It could be the publishing, it could be the drafting, it could even be the most fragile of ideas. You mentioned you've got a bit of a support group there. How are your support groups organised? Because it is a lonely pursuit sometimes, writing, and we need those people. So how are yours organised?
I am so lucky. So I've got Julie, of course, and she's been a friend now for many years, and she's there in the trenches with me. She knows exactly what it's like. So I've got her. But I've now also, of course, got a literary agent who reads everything that I want to send to my editor beforehand. So she checks and, gives me comments, tells me if it's good enough to send and not good enough to send, and is a real support. So I've got that. My editor at Penguin is a lovely, lovely lady called Hannah, and her comments on my work are just invaluable as well. I've got beta readers that read my work before anybody sees it. Just 2 or 3 trusted people who, for different reasons, I chose them for different reasons. One is a man, because I like to have a man look at my work and make sure that I am reflecting the male experience as authentically as possible. And he's been very helpful in keeping me on track and not making my men do things that he's pulled me up on a couple of times with my male characters, which has been hugely helpful. I've got one beta reader who I've never met in person. She's not on social media. I've never seen her face. We've never Zoomed. We communicate purely by email. And she is a beta reader who I met through a Curtis Brown course, in fact. And she's also a writer. She's writing a book set in the First World War and hoping to get that published soon. But the reason she's so invaluable is because she's reading my work as almost a stranger. She's never even heard my voice. She doesn't know my social media, presence. She doesn't know much about me at all. And so she's only got my words. And that's what I need from her, because if you give it to your friends and family to read, if you give your work to friends and family to read, bless them. They're just hearing you, or they want to know, was that based on me? Or, and it's like, no, it's not. But when you give it to someone who doesn't know you, they don't hear your voice. They just hear the voice of the character, the voice of the story, and whether it works or not. And so she's brilliant.
It must also help as well, because particularly with the feedback from somebody that doesn't know you at all and has never met you, never heard your voice, because there is that element of hearing the author's voice and then going, that's how the book's supposed to sound. I can sort of put that to it now. And I was wondering, of the advice that you've got back, the feedback you've got, if there's anything that's been the best piece of advice or the best piece of feedback that you've got from any of this support group that you've gone, okay, that has changed the game with what I'm doing now. I've got something come through that's gone, wow, okay, yes, I hear you. I see what you're talking about. This is something that I want to incorporate into my work. Is there anything like that you could share?
I can't think of anything specifically to tell you about in that sense, but I can say that I have 3 beta readers, and the reason for that is also because if one beta reader makes a comment about something and I don't agree with them, I can let it go. But if a second and then a third beta reader makes the same point, I absolutely cannot ignore that. I wouldn't ignore it even if one beta reader said it, but there have been occasions when a beta reader has said something and I've gone, no, you haven't quite got that, or just read a bit further, or I'll give you the next chapter and you'll realise why I've done that. But once you've had the same comment from all 3, you cannot ignore that. So that's why I have more than one beta reader.
That's a great piece of advice. I love the fact that you've got this collective temperature taking that's going on. That is something that I don't think even I've developed in my own writing. I don't have that. I have constant arguments between feedback and what I was trying to make some of my rudimentary books work with. But to have, like you say, more than one person at least leaning in the same direction, and you start to go, yeah, okay, maybe I have accidentally made something uncomfortable to read, uncomfortable to work with and traverse. So yeah, it's great to have those touchstones of several bits of feedback coming in. Okay, so the enormous debt to courses is evident, and I love that, because I hope to encourage people to be doing the workshops and the courses at the festival that we're planning next year. But leaving behind writing just for a moment, when it comes to reading, there's been a bit of a theme to the podcast as well, that reading is often very important. I haven't found an author yet that's turned around and said, no, reading means nothing to me. I don't think I've read anything in my life. I just write. I am a pure writer. It's all about broadcast, not reception. And I'm looking at you shaking your head, and I suspect we're not going to find that extremely unique individual this time. But so what are you reading at the moment? And I guess the sort of attached question to that is, it's a combo really of, how do you find time to read? And are you careful about what you're reading? Because it can work potentially its way into what you're researching or what you're preparing. So I'm sorry, it's a multi-layered question on reading. But
no,
yeah,
again, it's a brilliant question, Russ. Brilliant question. Reading is breathing to me. I read all the time. So I get asked a lot, how do you read so many books? I've always got about 10 on the go. How do you read so much? And the answer to that is because I fit it into every aspect of my life. So if I go anywhere, I have a book with me. If I have 5 minutes spare, I read. I very rarely watch television or films, very rarely. But occasionally I do, and occasionally they're very good, and occasionally it's important to watch something. So I'm not anti it, but it's a rare event that I turn the television on. I can read when I'm ironing, I can read in the bath, I read in the garden, I read in the car, not when I'm driving. it isn't a question of how to find time, because my life is just, if I'm not doing something else, I'm reading. And I just find reading is just it's a calming influence on me. It is a distraction for me a lot of the time, and I need that quite a lot. It takes me to a different place. It's a means of escaping. It's definitely saved my life on many, many, many occasions. I love learning about things, particularly through fiction, though. You know, dry non-fiction books are necessary sometimes when you're doing research. Of course they are, but they're not an easy read. So I do sometimes prefer to read fiction. I'm not careful with what I read, to be honest. So, for instance, when I was writing Women of War, I was reading In Memoriam by Alice Winn. And I know that some authors would say, my God, you should have stayed well away from anything written in the same period, or, because how can you be sure that things won't be, by osmosis brought into your own writing? But I don't think it works like that with me. I'm awed by really good writers, and I bask in their fantastic sentences, and I study their sentence structure and their story structure. And why has that particularly moved me? Why is a story about two young men in love in the First World War, why is that so moving? And I try and get to the bottom of it, and as a kind of exercise of discovery, really. So I think it's important. So I'm reading lots of books at the moment. Some of them are for research. So I'm hosting the Romney Literary Day on the 10th of May, and we've got some wonderful authors coming for that. We've got Dr. Jonathan Healey, who writes about revolutionary England, the women of the 17th century. So I'm reading his book, The Blazing World, at the moment. We've got Dr. Kim Simpson coming to talk about women in Regency times, like the contemporaries of Jane Austen, who have been now completely forgotten, but were huge in their day, were fantastic authors, should not have been forgotten, but have been forgotten. So I'm reading a book called Jane Austen's Bookshelf, which is by Rebecca Romney, who's a rare book collector, and she went on a quest to find the women writers who shaped Jane Austen. I'm reading Muckraker by Sidney Robinson, which is about the life and times of W.T. Stead, who was Britain's first investigative journalist in the Victorian times. He did some astonishing stuff. He was a very unusual guy. He did some quite contentious stuff, which probably we don't have time to go into now, so I won't. His life is very, very interesting. Then I'm reading historical fiction such as The Art of a Lie by Laura Shepherd Robinson. I really admire her work. Books by debut novelists and books by authors I've never heard of before. Life Cycle of a Moth by Ro Irvin. The Rush by Beth Lewis. I love Hallie Rubenhold's books, and I've just got her Story of a Murder, The Wives, The Mistress and Dr. Crippen. So she's taken a different angle on the whole story of Dr. Crippen, and she's looking at his wives and his mistress and what their lives were like. And she's taken the female aspect of that whole horrible event. Operation Tulip by Deborah Swift. That's a Second World War book, which I should have finished by now, but it's taking time to read because I want to read it carefully. And also the last one I've got written down here, which is one of my books, is The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter, which is The Adventures of Judith Shakespeare by Grace Tiffany. So again, it's looking at Shakespeare's daughter Judith and what she got up to.
It's a beautiful collection, and I think representative of what you were saying about you're not too... It sounds like, when you say you're not too selective, it sounds like, it's like someone saying, I quite eat a lot of junk food. I don't care. I'm not selective. But what I think you're trying to say is that you selected, but the selection is wild. It's, I think David Hendy used the phrase, be wide in what you're looking for in terms of what you read. And I often say to people, read wildly. Just, if there's something, read it. Doesn't matter what it is, read it. It could be a menu. I don't mind, but read it and see if there's something in it that grabs you a little bit. And I loved your point there. I love the sentence of, you mentioned you bask in sentences. It reminds me of an interview that people can catch out there. I think it's Joan Didion talking about how she studied one sentence of Hemingway's over and over again, like she's sort of rolling it around her mouth. She's going over and over on the page and going, why is it good? What is in this that is phenomenal? And I think she comes to a sort of conclusion, which I'm probably going to paraphrase badly, but that she came to the conclusion that it is what's missing that makes it great. It's so simple and small, but it's what it's not saying is so profound. It's leaving you with what it's not saying, which is even more incredible. And you do notice these things when you see other people's writing, and you get this sort of inspiration. I wish that people could see sometimes that gift that reading so much can bring, is you start to develop this sense and this taste of reading, that and the sort of sentences that are being created, that is a bit, it sounds a little bit snobby. It sounds a little bit pretentious. It's a bit like, a wine buff saying, can you get these notes from the wine? But it is there if you read a huge amount and you explore it, and you read it fast, you read it slow. You will find there are those sentences that you go, wow, there's something in that. And I now notice it, whereas I don't think I would have done before.
Yeah, it's certainly something you learn over time. You recognise good writing. It's very hard to pinpoint quite what it is. And you're right, quite often it's what hasn't been written. It's what is being connected in your brain that the writer has been able to put there without spoon feeding you. So you've had to make a slight jump in order to understand. And that then has fired your emotions and has fired your investment in the book. It's a very difficult thing to get right. You want to put as much on the page to help the reader, but I've learnt over time that actually less is more, and that readers need to have to make a jump to invest in a book, in a story. If you spoon feed it to them all the time, it's boring. It's too easy, which is quite often why I won't watch films, because I feel that that's just giving it to you in its entirety, and I don't have to do anything except sit back and watch. Whereas with a good book, you're having to make so many inferences and connections and remember things and read stuff between the lines, that it just is much more intelligent and much more interesting. So, but it's a difficult thing to do, and I'm not saying I've got it right. We're constantly improving, and that's the other joy of writing, is that you constantly improve, and if you work at it hard enough, it's a craft, it's an art. You'll get much better the more you do, and there's no other way of doing it than just writing and honing and editing and crafting.
Absolutely. And it's that, I love that idea of leaving space for the imagination to do something with what's been written. And I echo you there completely. I can feel it where, you've written something and you go, I've left it open for them to make the jump. I can feel that they might make a jump there. I don't think I've ever intentfully managed to do that, but I may have accidentally managed on occasion. But I guess that craft, as it develops over time, maybe that's something you can begin to go, I think I'm going to be doing this here, and I think it's gonna feel good for that reader to see what I've left open for them. I've got a couple of questions that we always ask towards the end of the podcast. The first one, it can be a little bit put you on the spot, but it is there a question? You've done a lot of interviews around your books, and I know you've also interviewed people at the festivals that you've not only been to, but also have created. And is there ever been a question that you wish you'd been asked? Something that has just never been brought up, and you wish it had?
Well, that's another good question. Nobody ever asks me, but I do sometimes ask authors, and it throws them a little bit. I ask them, are there any secrets that you put in your books that no one else will know is in there, or only one or two people will ever pick up on? I love that question. And I can't say, because I haven't done a poll or anything, so who knows? But I have a feeling that a lot of authors probably put stuff in their work that either only they know refers to something, or one or two people will recognise as, that's a little homage to. So, for instance, I always have a dog in my books, and normally the dog has different coloured eyes, and that's because the dog we once had, who's now no longer with us, had different coloured eyes.
So an homage to your dog. What was your dog's name, if I may ask?
Oh, my dog was Pickle.
Pickle.
Yeah.
An homage to Pickle in every book.
There will be a dog that isn't Pickle, but has got funny coloured eyes, and is her that I'm just constantly remembering in my books. No, not a major character or anything like that, but so things like that. So I like to ask the question of authors, and I get interesting answers to that if they can share. Sometimes they can't share. Sometimes you have written a character that is based on somebody, and they can't share that. It would be too too revealing. I use eye colour a lot as well. I use my character's eye colour can sometimes denote people in my life who I'm channeling to write that character, and they have the same eye colour as the person I know.
I was going to say, how would you answer it? But I think you've just answered it. We have a combination of it's always eye colour. It comes back to eye colour for you, but that's wonderful. So your secrets are in the eye colours. So now anyone reading your books is going to be, oh, there's a mention of an eye colour now. So the very last question before I can let you go back to your wonderful life is, again, it's an inspired question. I think not one of my own. I borrowed this completely from the Hay Festival. I think it was asked of Sarah Pascoe a long time ago now. But the question is there anything you'd go back to? We say 16-year-old you, but it would be you prior to all of this experience. Is there anything you go back to you and say that you really needed to hear, or it would have been so helpful to have someone that has said that to you at the beginning of your journey? And what would it have been? What would you actually say?
I would have said to my 16-year-old self, you can be an author. It's going to take you many, many years of hard work. Just don't ever give up that dream and you will become an author. At that time, it just wasn't something that was even on the cards. I couldn't have envisaged being an author because I didn't know anybody in the industry at all. But I would have said to my 16-year-old self, just stay focused. And I might have become an author much sooner. I was 45 when I won the Penguin competition, which, back at the age of 16 was an ancient woman.
Yes, I know that feeling when I look at my own age. It's like, yeah, I was definitely very, very old people like that when they were my age right now.
But now I know that actually those extra years have given me life experience, and I think I can, if I'd been writing stories back when I was in my 20s, I wouldn't have had much to write about. I wouldn't really have. I admire these young authors who can churn things out at the age of 25. I think, wow, well done you, because I didn't know how life worked.
It's almost in reverse of the mathematicians. They say to the mathematicians, by the age of 27, if you haven't changed the world, you may not ever do that. And then for authors, it's like, don't worry. It's all going to come to you later on, I promise you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Lou, thank you so much for your time today on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure to get you on here, and thank you so much again for all of the goodwill and support and everything you've given us here at the festival. We're a huge fan of you for everything you've been able to help us with and inspire us to keep going in many respects. So thank you again. And that's it for this podcast episode. There will be more coming soon. And if you are interested in any of the information about the Eastbourne Literary Festival, then please pop along to our website. The link will be in the information that goes out with the podcast. And if you are interested in being on the podcast, then also go and reach out to us at the website, and we'd love to hear from you.